Hey Dungeons & Dragons community, I love D&D, and 5th edition is my favorite edition. But that doesn't mean it's perfect, and I think we all agree a couple adjustments could make things even better. I've done a series of those adjustments, and I'm providing them to anyone who wants them. There's no cost. Feel free to download them, share them, use them. In these videos I'm explaining how those adjustments work, why I made any decisions for the changes I made, and today I'm going to go through my changes for 7th level spells. As always, a link to the document is in the video description for your convenience. As well, if you are having trouble viewing that document, then go to my WordPress account. There is a link in the video description, and I have converted all the documents to PDF on that account. So today we're talking about 7th level spells, the Treantmonk Variant. Now 7th level spells are kind of unique in Dungeons & Dragons in that I think it has some of the weakest spells of all the levels and some of the strongest spells of all the levels. So the divide between the weak spells and the strong spells is bigger than ever. At the very low end we have the absolutely abysmal Canaan sword. At the upper level we have the absolutely broken simulacrum. Now in the variant so far, what I've generally figured I would do is I'm not going to nerf strong spells because strong spells are fun. And the point of this isn't to take away people's fun. But simulacrum is different. Simulacrum is actually a problem within D&D. If your party wizard gets access to simulacrum and they know what they're doing, this can break your game. This really can actually break your game. And we can end up with a situation where the wizard alone is more powerful than the rest of the party combined. So that doesn't make it more fun. That's less fun for the other players when the wizard can simply duplicate them and have basically the same character plus the wizard. So this will be one of those cases where I actually do take a strong spell and make it weaker. So that said, let's get started. So the first spell I want to talk about is Delayed Blast Fireball. Now, what Delayed Blast Fireball does is it creates a fireball that does 12d6 damage, so that's like an upcast fireball. In fact, if you cast a fireball at 7th level, it would do that much damage. With a Delayed Blast Fireball, you add concentration, and then every round you concentrate, the damage increases by 1d6 for up to 1 minute. So that means you can have your 12d6 fireball. If you wait for 10 rounds, it can do 21d6 damage. But concentration is a big investment, and the damage here increases very slowly. 1d6 per round in any combat really isn't going to add up very quickly when we're at this level. And now if we wait the full 10 rounds, then Delayed Blast Fireball will do a reasonable amount of damage. But it's hard to set that up. You need your concentration, you need that full minute time for preparation, and then you get this spell that does a little bit more damage than most other spells at this level. So what I felt Delayed Blast Fireball really needed to be a good spell was a little bit more payoff for the investment of the time. Delayed Blast Fireball as just a fireball, you might as well just cast Fireball. The whole point of Delayed Blast Fireball is that wait and that investment of time so that we get a bigger boom. So I wanted to make sure that we could do that. So with the Treantmonk Variant, the spell mostly remains the same. Except I've reduced the base damage of the spell to 8d6. So now the base damage of the spell is the same as a regular fireball. But the other thing I've changed is if at the end of your turn the bead has not yet detonated, the damage increases by 2d6. So the damage will be increasing at twice the rate of a normal Delayed Blast Fireball. What this means is the maximum amount of damage this spell could do is 26d6 damage. That's pretty impressive damage, and it's going to pay off for the caster that has the time to invest to take advantage of a Delayed Blast Fireball. The other change I've made is to the scaling. The scaling with the original spell is the same as scaling of Fireball. So if you use a higher level spell slot, and remember there's only 2 more spell slots we can use, this is already a 7th level spell, what you would get is 1d6 to the base damage of the spell. Now increasing a 7th level spell to an 8th level spell to increase the damage by 1d6 is ridiculous. What I've done here now is, again, I wanted to focus more on the investment of the delayed portion of the spell. So now when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 8th level or higher, the damage increase each round increases by 1d6 for each slot level above 7th. So if you use an 8th level slot, you would be increasing the damage by 3d6 for each round of delay. The next spell I want to talk about is Divine Word. So Divine Word is a cleric spell, and this is kind of a spell for dealing with fodder for the most part. It's a bonus action spell, and what happens is you cast a spell, 7th level spell, and creatures that have 50 hit points or fewer have an effect if they are within range. The range is 30 feet. And if they have 50 hit points, not much happens. They're deafened. At 40 hit points or fewer, they're deafened and blinded, so now we're getting into a significant effect. 30 hit points or fewer, they actually add a stun effect, and from then on it's just bad. Now, they get a charisma saving throw. If they make their charisma saving throw, nothing happens. If the target is a celestial, an elemental, a fae, or a fiend, then it doesn't matter how many hit points it has. If it fails its saving throw, it's forced back to its plane of origin, if it's not there already. So it can work as a banish in that regard. Now, the thing to remember is we're 13th level. So at 13th level, and if we're talking about only really significant effects for 40 hit points or lower, creatures that are 40 hit points or lower, when we're that level, are fodder. Now, there is absolutely fodder in combats that we have at that level. But what will happen is, because the Divine Word has a range of 30 feet, we're not getting as much fodder as we probably should, considering we are investing a 7th level spell. If we are investing a 7th level spell to deal with fodder, it should be astounding. So for me, the fix here was the range. That 30-foot range wasn't enough. I think we need to make it to 60-foot range. This is still a spell for dealing with fodder, but it's a more effective spell. The next spell I wanted to talk about is Firestorm. This is kind of a blast spell for clerics, druids, and sorcerers. And it creates this shapeable blast that hits creatures. It's an instantaneous effect. They take fire damage. The fire damage it does is 7d10 damage. With a 7th level spell, we should be doing more damage than 7d10 with a fire blast. Now, being able to shape it is certainly useful. The area is big, but 7d10 again, at this level, we should be doing more damage than that. This is a 7th level spell. Consider that with 7th level spells, we are at the level where generally you're only going to be able to cast one of these in a day. I mean, a 20th level caster could cast 2 7th level slots in a day, but any other caster is only going to get one. So it needs to be significant, and 7d10 damage is less than 40 points of damage, and there's a saving throw for half. That's nothing for a 7th level spell. If we're blasting using our 7th level spells, it should be significant. So for me, the only change I felt needed to be made was the damage needed to be increased. So I went from 7d10 fire damage to 10d10 fire damage. That's still not a ton of damage, but for a 7th level spell, I think it's appropriate. The next spell I want to talk about is Canaan's Magnificent Mansion. Now, I kind of consider this kind of the upgrade to Leomund's Tiny Hut, because it is just the next step in great long rest spells. Creates an extra dimensional space. It's this mansion. It has servants to serve you. It has food. It's completely safe. So when we're talking about just from a role-playing perspective, Magnificent Mansion is something I want my Archmage to be doing instead of just doing a Leomund's Tiny Hut. The issue with Magnificent Mansion is Leomund's Tiny Hut is still pretty safe for long rests, and it's a ritual. Magnificent Mansion is not a ritual. So that is the one way it's not an upgrade. So for me, that's the fix for Magnificent Mansion. And because we make it a ritual, we have to make sure that we can't cast it more than once. So I also add, if you cast a spell again while a previous dwelling is in existence, the previous spell ends. So you can't create a whole bunch of Magnificent Mansions. Okay, so that brings us to one of the biggest challenges of 7th level spells, which is Canaan's Sword. How do I fix this one? So Canaan's Sword is normally a 1-action casting spell. It lasts 1 minute. It's concentration. And what it does is it creates a sword made of force, and you can make melee spell attacks against targets of your choice that are next to the sword. On a hit, they take 3d10 force damage. And until the spell ends, you can use a bonus action on each of your turns to move the sword up to 20 feet to a spot you can see and make another attack. So if we compare this to the 2nd level spell, Spiritual Weapon, this is similar, except it adds concentration. The sword doesn't move faster, it doesn't last longer, and frankly, even if you upcast Spiritual Weapon, the Spiritual Weapon will do more damage on top of that. So an upcast Spiritual Weapon is better than Mordenkainen's sword objectively. So this is an abysmal spell. So how do we make it worthwhile? Well, I think we have to use Spiritual Weapon as kind of a guide here. Spiritual Weapon's a second level spell, lasts a minute, doesn't use concentration, use your bonus action every round to make an attack, D8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. That is a good template for us to start with. So the first thing we're going to do with Mordenkainen's sword is we're going to change the casting time. Spiritual Weapon takes a bonus action to cast. Mordenkainen's sword now takes a bonus action to cast. The second thing we need to do is remove concentration. Spiritual Weapon doesn't require concentration. Mordenkainen's sword doesn't require concentration. But the thing is, Mordenkainen's sword is not a second level spell. It is a 7th level spell. We should be seeing 5 levels worth of advanced power here. So the first change we're going to make this better than Spiritual Weapon is we're going to increase the duration. So instead of 1 minute, it's going to last us an hour. So you are going to cast this, you're going to have it for 1 hour, no concentration. So you create a sword-shaped plane of force that hovers within range. It lasts for the duration. When the sword appears, you make a melee spell attack against the target of your choice within 5 feet of the sword. On a hit, the target takes 3d10 force damage. Until the spell ends, you can use a bonus action on each of your turns to move the sword up to 60 feet to a spot you can see and repeat the attack. So we're also going to increase the speed because that's actually one of the disadvantages of Spiritual Weapon, because you can only move it 20 feet on your turn. And the same restriction was in Mordenkainen's sword. You could only move it 20 feet on your turn. 7th level spell. Doesn't make sense. We're going to make it a fast-moving sword, moves around the battlefield, harassing our enemies. Now it's going to move up to 60 feet on our turn. So this is now a strictly upgraded Spiritual Weapon. Is it worth 5 additional levels? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's reasonable. It's not a bad spell anymore as a 7th level spell. That brings us to another spell that's pretty bad, which is Prismatic Spray. So Prismatic Spray does create a big effect. It's a 60-foot cone, but it is terrible. What happens is you're going to cast a spell, 60-foot cone, random effect on each target. Now, if you're going to have random effects, they need to be higher than regular effects because that uncertainty is a downside. So then you need to have some kind of enhanced effect to be an upside. But Prismatic Spray went the other direction. So not only do you have a random effect, the random effect is also weaker. For example, they might take 10d6 fire damage. They might take 10d6 acid damage. They might take 10d6 lightning damage. So you have an unreliable damage type, completely random damage type, 10d6 damage, 7th level spell. Remember again that we were doing 8d6 damage with a fireball at 3rd level. Now you're rolling a d8. The first 5 rolls are all 10d6 damage of different damage types. And none of them are great damage types. There's no force on there. There's no radiant on there. But poison, fire, cold, acid, lightning are all on there. These are all relatively commonly resisted damage types. And the damage dice are weak for the level. Now if you roll a 6, then we get a little more interesting effect. We get to restrain the target. 7th level spell, restrain the target. And that's only on a failed saving throw. On a successful saving throw, nothing happens. And then if it fails to save 3 times, it is petrified. And then if we roll a 7, it is blinded, again on a failed save. On a successful save, nothing happens. So, kind of what we'd expect with a 2nd level spell. Now if it fails the 2nd saving throw, it's banished to another plane of existence. Though unlike a banishment or anything like that, there's no restriction to returning back to this plane. And then if you roll an 8, it's struck by 2 rays. But when I look at this, 10d6, save for half, commonly resisted damage types, restrained, blinded, these aren't great effects on their own for a 7th level spell. So if we roll an 8 and get the 2nd ray, that's when maybe things start to get to the point where, okay, this is kind of where a 7th level spell should be, especially if we're looking at random effects. So that is the change I've made to Prismatic Spray, is now it's largely the same spell, but for each target you roll 2d8s to determine which color rays affect it. So we're seeing this cone, and there's the full spectrum of colors, and there's chaotic movement between them. Creatures are going to get hit with more than one ray reasonably, I think. And then mechanically, it fits more in line with what a 7th level spell should do. So you can roll 2d8. They're going to get hit by 2 rays. And if you roll an 8, the target is struck by an additional ray, roll twice more, re-rolling any 8s. So that means there is technically a possibility, if you roll 2 8s right off the bat, of hitting them with 4 rays. But in most cases, what you're going to end up with is 20d6, random damage types, commonly resisted or immune damage types, save for half. For a 7th level spell, I think that is reasonable. Consider that at 9th level, we'll be doing 40d6 damage over a much, much bigger area. The next spell I want to look at is Regenerate. Now, my main issue with Regenerate is the primary feature of this spell is the target's severed body members, fingers, legs, tails, and so on, if any, are restored after 2 minutes. If you have the severed part and hold it to the stump, the spell instantaneously causes the limb to knit to the stump. My problem with this is there is no mechanics in the game, at least with the base mechanics, unless we talk about optional rules, to remove body parts. So this just isn't going to come up. The other part of the spell is you get some healing, 48 plus 15 hit points, not a lot of hit points, and for the duration of the spell, which is 1 hour, you receive 1 hit point at the start of each of your turns, so that is potentially 10 hit points per minute. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a spell that's a higher spell level than heal. So, as a healing spell, I think it's on the weak side. And since the spell is called Regenerate, I felt if we were going to bump up this spell, that's where we really need to boost it, is on the regeneration of hit points. So the only change I've made here is for the duration of the spell, the target regains 2 hit points at the start of each of its turns, 20 hit points each minute. Now the next spell I want to talk about is Sequester. Now Sequester is an incredibly circumstantial spell. You cast it on a willing creature or an object, and basically you kind of put it in a suspended animation. It can't be detected by any means, it's invisible, it doesn't age. It's largely something that is going to be often used by DMs, but if a player wants to use it, it's very difficult. And the reason it's very difficult is because it's super expensive. It is 5,000 gold pieces to cast this spell. And that 5,000 gold pieces is consumed with every casting of the spell. As a player, even if I found some interesting uses for Sequester, or I had the circumstantial use for Sequester, I'm not going to probably take it, because with a 5,000 gold piece casting cost, that's just way too much. So I've reduced the material component cost to a powder composed of diamond, emerald, ruby, or sapphire dust worth at least 500 gold pieces, which the spell consumes. I don't think the 5,000 gold pieces is important to the flavor of the spell. I think the 500 gold pieces works just fine. Sequester is still not a spell I'm going to take with my average wizard, but it is something that, at least if I had a circumstance where I might find use for it, I'd consider casting it. That brings us to Simulacrum. This is the hardest spell to deal with. Whenever I'm looking at making something weaker, that's hard. People have a negative reaction to it. But Simulacrum is a problem in the game. It is potentially more powerful than any of the 8th level spells in the game, and it is potentially more powerful than many of the 9th level spells in the game. This spell really will break your game. We often talk about spells or abilities breaking your game, and often that's hyperbole, because, often something that's too powerful will say it breaks your game. It doesn't really break your game. Healing Spirit doesn't break your game. It's a good spell, but it doesn't destroy D&D. Simulacrum can. Simulacrum is a real problem in the game. When you have your Diviner cast Simulacrum, and that Simulacrum casts Simulacrum to create another Simulacrum, we can end up with loops that cause problems. Because what we can have is, let's say we have, a 15th level Diviner. So that 15th level Diviner uses a 7th level slot, casts Simulacrum on themselves. They get a Simulacrum. That Simulacrum no longer has a 7th level slot, but has an 8th level slot. So it will use its 8th level slot to cast Simulacrum on the initial Diviner again, creating a copy of itself, and so on, and so on, and so on. You can see a problem there. The other thing is then all these Diviners have all these portents. They take a long rest. They have all these portents again. They take a long rest. They have all these portents again. Even though their spell slots don't come back, they get all their other abilities back. And that's a problem. The other thing is the spell says that if the Simulacrum is damaged, you can repair it in a laboratory using alchemical supplies. But the thing is that it doesn't restrict it to that. There's nothing saying a Simulacrum can't just take a long rest or receive a healing spell. Those things are obviously restricted by intent, but not by the text of the spell. So my goal here was to bring Simulacrum down to the point where it's still a fantastic spell, but not totally broken. And I think I've come up with the right combination here, though it took a little bit of thought. So the base casting time, range, components, duration all remain the same. The initial spell description remains the same. The Simulacrum is friendly to you and creatures you designate. It obeys your spoken commands, moving and acting in accordance with your wishes, and acting on your turn in combat. All the same. The Simulacrum lacks the ability to learn or become more powerful, so it never increases its level or other abilities. That's the same. Nor does it gain any benefits from short or long rests. That's different. Before, that was not specifically restricted. Now it is. What does that mean? It means you can't regain spell slots, but it also means you can't regain limited abilities. Your Simulacrum has Portent. That's great. But once they use it, there's no way for them to get it back. Your Simulacrum has Wild Shape. That's great. But once they use it, there's no way for them to get it back. And a Simulacrum with spell slots may not use a spell slot above 5th level. So no Simulacrums casting Simulacrum. In fact, we're restricting all the spell levels that are normally restricted. The game is actually really good for preventing you from increasing your spell slot casting above 5th level, except through Simulacrum. That is a loophole that allows you to cast multiple spells above 5th level. So we're going to close that. The Simulacrum can't cast spells above 5th level anymore. That means the most obvious use of Simulacrum, the wizard casting it on themselves, is actually maybe not the best anymore. And then the last change is, if the Simulacrum is damaged, it can only be repaired in an alchemical laboratory. So no more ambiguous terms there. That's the only way to restore hit points on the Simulacrum. This is still a really good spell. I'm telling you, evaluating spells is what I do. And Simulacrum, as I have done it here, although I've reduced it a lot, it is still a really good spell. This is still a spell that would be my first selection for a wizard when I got to that level. It's kind of astounding to me that I can make that many reductions on a spell, and it would still be the best spell of that level. And the final spell I want to talk about is Symbol. This is a long description spell, and I'm not going to go through it because I've only made one change. My issue with this spell has always been the same. 1,000 gold pieces per casting is absolutely insane. We don't want to take a spell and have it prepared on our list when we're going to have to spend 1,000 gold pieces every time we cast it. And Symbol, if we didn't have the material component, I think it would be a good spell, but it wouldn't be an insanely powerful spell. So why this super expensive material component? So we're going to take the material component of 1,000 gold pieces per casting and reduce it to 100 gold pieces per casting. 100 gold pieces per casting at this level? Okay, I could do that. That might be a reason why I might want to take this spell that looks pretty neat, but I never have taken it before because I can't possibly be spending 1,000 gold pieces per casting. So that's it for 7th level spells. Let me know in the comments down below if there's any 8th level spells you specifically want me to look at. Remember, I'm only looking at Player's Handbook spells. Same for 9th level spells. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to do the 8th level and 9th level spell variants. And then that should be it for the Player's Handbook Treantmonk Variant. So until next week, I'm going to sit back, relax, have some fun, because D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you next week.